Okay, let's dive right into this explainer by looking at a genuinely fascinating study on what it truly means to be American in the 21st century. We hear a lot of assumptions out there about national identity, but when you really dig into the data, and especially when you look at the deep, sprawling historical roots of the land itself, a much more complex and, frankly, much more interesting picture starts to emerge. So here is the core puzzle we're trying to solve today. Is increasing ethnic diversity changing our very definition of American identity? Well, sociologist Deborah J. Schildkraut actually set out to answer exactly this by analyzing how the normative content of American identity is defined right now. It's a question that feels incredibly modern, right? But as we're going to see, the answer is deeply, deeply embedded in our past.
To get to the bottom of this, Schildkraut tested what's known as the multiple traditions theory. She really wanted to explore if a multicultural America naturally creates a multi-credal one. Basically, instead of one single unifying tradition, a strict monolith of Americanism, this theory suggests that being American is actually defined by a complex, broad, and sometimes even downright contradictory set of norms.
To really wrap our heads around this, here's our roadmap for today. First, the American identity puzzle. Second, America's first inhabitants. Third, diverse indigenous empires. Fourth, the European arrival. Fifth, the colonial collision. And finally, a multi-credal nation.
Section 1. The American Identity Puzzle, a modern question.
Schildkraut's study relies on a really wide-ranging set of norms to provide an empirical, data-driven assessment of how Americans view themselves today. She wanted to move way beyond your typical public opinion poll to measure the actual content of American identity. The big question is whether the changing demographic face of the country fundamentally alters what it means to be American, or, and this is key, if extreme complexity has actually been the standard all along.
Section 2. America's first inhabitants. Deep roots.
Human history here didn't just start a few centuries ago. We are talking tens of thousands of years. The prevailing theory is that Paleoindians crossed Beringia, which is a land bridge connecting Siberia to present-day Alaska, perhaps as early as 30,000 years ago. By 10,000 BCE, human presence was firmly, permanently established, and these early inhabitants adapted remarkably well. They transitioned from hunting Ice Age megafauna, like mammoths, to foraging, and eventually to full-on agriculture. By 3000 BCE, we literally see corn being grown in the valleys of Arizona and New Mexico, completely paving the way for advanced early villages with primitive irrigation systems.
Section 3. Diverse indigenous empires, overlapping cultures.
Long before European contact, North America was already this vibrant tapestry of distinct, highly developed cultures. Out in the Southwest, you had the Anasazi constructing massive, apartment-like stone and adobe pueblos built directly into cliff faces. Over in the Midwest and Southeast, the Mississippian culture was building incredible earthwork mounds. Up on the coast, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest thrived on a really rich salmon-based economy, celebrating their wealth through elaborate gift-giving potlatch feasts. And in the Northeast, the Iroquois were busy building complex political alliances. This was absolutely not a monolith. It was a vast continent of overlapping, highly diverse societies.
To put the scale of all this into perspective, just consider the number 20,000. The Mississippian city of Cahokia, which was located right near modern-day St. Louis, had an estimated population of 20,000 people in the 12th century. The whole city centered around a massive structure called Monk's Mound that stood 100 feet tall. To give you a little context here, Cahokia was actually larger than London at that time. It was this bustling, massive hub depending on agriculture, trade, and totally complex societal structures. Further east, in present-day upstate New York, the Iroquois formed a highly sophisticated political union in the mid-15th century known as the Iroquois Confederacy. They managed to unite 5 distinct tribes, the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, under a governing council of 50 sachem chiefs. This early complex governance was incredibly powerful. It allowed them to expand their territory, wage war, and eventually push smaller tribes further west. Actually, some historians even suggest that their unique confederacy model contributed to early political thinking during the development of the United States government itself. Section 4. The European Arrival, a Continental Shift.
Then, of course, the arrival of Europeans across the Atlantic triggered what is known as the Columbian Exchange. This was a massive, unprecedented transfer of agricultural goods, livestock, and culture that permanently altered both the Old and New worlds. Europeans introduced horses, cattle, and hogs to the Americas. And in return,
They took back transformative crops like maize, tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco. This one exchange completely reshaped global diets, economies, and entire ecosystems forever. However, we have to acknowledge that this contact also brought devastating consequences. Europeans carried Eurasian diseases like smallpox and measles, and because Native Americans had absolutely no natural immunity to these Old World pathogens, horrific epidemics just swept across the continent. This resulted in the tragic decimation of indigenous populations. In fact, many native societies and their political structures were deeply, irreversibly disrupted by the sheer scale of these deaths well before large-scale European colonial settlement even truly began.
Section 5. The Colonial Collision. Overlapping Claims.
The land quickly became a chaotic collision of European powers, all with overlapping claims and totally different cultural norms. You have the Spanish establishing deep presences in the south and southwest, places like Florida, New Mexico, and Texas. The Dutch settled the mid-Atlantic, creating New Netherland, which actually acted as a barrier to British expansion until the British swooped in, took it over in 1664, and renamed it New York. Meanwhile, the British were establishing their own distinct footholds, starting with Jamestown in 1607 and the arrival of the Pilgrims at Plymouth on the Mayflower in 1620. So the very foundation of the nation was quite literally built on multiple overlapping traditions and fiercely competing empires.
Section 6. A multi-credal nation. The past explains the present.
So, when we circle back and look at the findings from Schildkraut's modern study with all this history in mind, it suddenly makes perfect sense. Her data confirms the multiple traditions perspective of American identity. Think about it. A land built by tens of thousands of years of diverse indigenous empires, followed immediately by a collision of overlapping colonial powers, is naturally going to result in a complex, broad, and even contradictory set of norms today. Her empirical assessment proves that it is nearly impossible to reduce what it means to be American into a single, neat little measure of Americanism. This diversity isn't some new phenomenon, it's literally baked into the very soil.
And the data shows that most Americans, regardless of their specific ethnic or immigrant background, actually share this complex view. They recognize that the norms constituting American identity just aren't monolithic. We collectively embrace this multifaceted, multi-credal reality because it accurately reflects the incredibly dense overlapping history of the nation we just talked about.
So, I want to leave you with this to ponder. If our history tells us that American identity has always been a dynamic, sometimes messy collision of multiple traditions, how will this ever-evolving, complex identity continue to shift as our demographics evolve in the 21st century? The only constant, it seems, is the complexity itself.